What Doty's done is spent a career studying myth and given us here, as he says, a comprehensive definition in 17 sections. So the abstract at the beginning of the article presents all 17 points and in narrative form, and at the bottom of page 533, you get all 17 again, this time numbered. So each of you will find a small selection of this list of these 17 points to most directly resonate with you, that will make most sense to you as you look at the living myths of our world. Keep close to this article. Keep conversant with the points that he makes. It will be helpful as a handle throughout the course, a handle to hold the very messy bundle that is history. What I'll do here is run through the list highlighting a few things. My presentation will be pretty skeletal, but it'll give you a sense of how to begin for yourself with this list. So 1 through 17. First, approaching myth means looking at a mythic corpus, a network of interrelated myths that are intertwined, often internally contradictory. There is no monomyth, no singular myth that everyone understands, agrees with, and lives by. That's never been the reality of human culture. No single story that holds the day, and it's increasingly true in our era, since in what some scholars have called the postmodern era, right? It's part of the postmodern project, the insistence upon relativity. Most simply, this can be put that our truths are relative to our experience. Now, the danger of postmodern relativity is the loss of shared significance, of a shared moral horizon, of anything that unifies us, that allows us to have a conversation, right? That if each of our truths is validated by our own individual experience, if there's no tether to some unified perspective, then we really do face the danger of not being able to communicate, of having no shared vocabulary. And so number 2, the culturally important aspect, really counters an excessive individualism by asserting cultural importance. America is complicated mythically. It's, as our emphasis on individualism has worked to balance itself against the need for a shared myth. Too great a concentration on the value of the individual has at times led to the segregation of marginalized communities, right? So the point is not to find and champion the dominant myth, sort of sneaking the monomyth in under the radar, right? That's not the goal. But to recognize that, as Walt Whitman said, we are vast. We contain multitudes. There's many myths that go into the American experiment and experience. So it can't just be that my truth is true for me and your truth is true for you, or we end up being able to do things like sideline non-dominant myths, non-dominant experiences. So that this turns into a world where the truths of Native Americans are only true for Native Americans, only relevant to those communities, and not to the U.S. as a larger body. And you can fill that in with Latinx Americans, Black Americans, women, gender nonconforming Americans, any marginalized group you want, right? But the danger is that, well, your myths are just relevant for you, and I don't have to consider them because I'm in whatever function, not you, right? The mythic corpus of America includes all of these, and is therefore relevant. They're each therefore relevant to all of us. So part of our job this semester will be to look at how those various groups and communities have developed a sense of communal mythos and how that relates to the larger cultural body. So number 3, myths are imaginal, and that, it's a fancy word, but really it just means it's an image, right? They imagistically hit you. They stick on your brain in that way. They're experientially true. They're recurrent. He uses this Greek word aletheia, which it means truth in Greek, but what the root is without Lethe, and this is the actual river Lethe. You can look into that, but the river Lethe in Greek myth was the river of forgetting. It's the river that once one dies, one's body dies, then one's self goes into the river of forgetfulness before the next stages happen. So truth is what can't be forgotten. It's the thing without forgetfulness. The myth is what cannot be forgotten because it's experientially true. And because it recurs, it keeps coming up, And often in the form of a story, which is number 4, which are more coherent than life. Stories are more coherent than life. They have a beginning, middle, end. and importantly, a very clear point of view. They always have a point of view, whether or not that point of view makes itself explicit. But recognizing the point of view helps us to understand where the story is coming from, what it understands its audience to be, what kind of agenda it has. Stories have those. They are coherent. Life is not, right? So one way that that myths have made this clear through their stories is through metaphoric and symbolic diction. Number 5. And the danger here is a dead metaphor. And what that means, it's where open, multivalent terms, metaphors, they stabilize, they cement themselves into a singular meaning, right? And social conformity prevails from that. And so we can think in terms of this. I've put this up there. You can think of patriotism, right? A patriot is a metaphor. We're talking about a revolutionary era and a certain kind of combatant person. That's what a patriot is. But now it's used as a metaphor for somebody who loves and stands up for America. Okay? But, you can think about what patriotism means to most Americans today, if we can even get in on that, if we have a clear understanding of what that means, if it has any relationship to the revolutionary period and the ideals established then. Does it have a living connection to that past? Or, has it just become a way to insist upon and determine a kind of social conformity, right? And so the image I've used here is the patriot on the bottom right of your screen. That's actually my high school mascot. Was that's Orange Glen High School's mascot. If you are familiar with Escondido, this is the OG Patriots, and it's a little revolutionary about itself, but it's not clear that image has any connection to what Americans today call patriotism. And so myths traffic in these kinds of metaphors, and as we as individuals try to become better readers of myth, better readers of culture, better citizens, part of our job is to recognize when metaphors are at play and to recognize when they've become deadened or cemented into a singular meaning. That's not the role of metaphor. They want to be open, multivalent, accessible to multiple communities, a diverse array of perspectives. I'm pretty sure that the high school mascot has cemented something. It's a strange mascot on its own, but anyway. So on to number 6, graphic imagery, right? So if you can get a clear sense of, if you can emblazon a picture on your mind, this is something like imaginal, but different because now we are looking specifically at the graphic imagery. Myth counters the abstract by embodying thought in specific images that hit your mind with and incur in emotional conviction and participation, which is different from rational knowing. It's not the same, right? It is a way of knowing, but it's not rational knowing. And your rational mind is not all of your mind. It's not the whole picture, right? So this is especially powerful for anyone who has what Jung, psychologist Carl Jung, called a mythically educated imagination. His idea here was that the more stories you know, the more heroes and traitors and success stories and failures and villains and that you have stories of in your mind, the more you see and feel your life in terms of those stories, the more you can respond to situations, difficult situations, emergent situations, in terms of a story that's helped you to understand what success or what failure might look like. We are what we myth, says Doty, and personal realization or self-understanding, these are enhanced by mythic knowledge. So the more myths you're aware of, the more you are able to self-determine in a way that can lend to integrity, right? Integrity is really thinking about what the right thing to do might be and also really trying to do it. It requires both situational awareness and self-reflection. And the more myths we have, it's like a library, a vocabulary of right things to do or wrong things to do. But it's worth considering. The more our heroes make us better at being ourselves. And primal foundational accounts. This is point 8. Not necessarily temporal. When we say primal, we think of first things, right? But it's not about just creation stories. Those are part of it. But by primal foundational accounts, what Doty's getting at here is, not just the beginning of time kind of things, but also foundational in terms of significance, in terms of what matters, right? And questioning sacred origins can make you a traitor within the culture within which you live. So if you want to know what a community holds sacred, what is foundational to this one or another community, uh, you can look for those things you're not allowed to question. And this I have Kaepernick. We'll read a little bit on this situation, which you're all familiar with. But Kaepernick was somebody who questioned a sacred ideal and did so with a purpose. But the kerfuffle, the political arguments that followed that indicate, without saying whether who's right, who's wrong, right? That's less my point here. My point here is that this is a person who challenged a certain kind of sacred myth. So on to 9, the real experienced world, the socially constructed and reinforced real. And I want you to think on this terms in terms of on this point in terms of Quinn's Ishmael. You'll read an excerpt from it and it will tap into this. Number 10, humankind's roles and relative statuses. And this has to do with pecking order or relative importance. And there are multiple norms for human fulfillment. So you can ask yourself, what's your goal and what hero serves it? What hero as a model could you have in your quiver that serves the goal that you yourself aspire to? One way to get at your own values, the ones you actually hold, is to ask yourself, who are my heroes, who are my villains, and why, right? Who do I hold up to great esteem? Who do I diminish the value or teachable importance of, and why, right? So number 11, myths convey political and moral values, sometimes in a compensatory way, to hide a kind of contemporary corruption, right? So, if you're conveying political and moral values as a way to bamboozle the public, that's we've seen that. That's part of what happens. But the images I have here, the one on the right speaks most directly to this, that there is this capitalist system that, has as its base the notion that some will rise and most will serve, right? But recognizing that the real experienced world, what Quinn will call the mother culture, is not something that we're always aware of. That's the joke that most of you have heard in the cartoon on the left. Culture, what culture, right? Water, what water? It's something we breathe so deeply that we often don't find ourselves thinking in explicit terms about it, thinking about it consciously, or being very aware about when we're facing it. So, number 12, systems of interpretation. And that plays into a lot of what we've just said. Yes, they are they systematically, through a coherent narrative, interpret the culture and the challenges it faces. Number 13, and this is a big one, individual experience within a universal perspective. He talks about it in terms of micro and macro, and the micro there would be individual, the macro would be universal. And he hints at this, when society experiences an era of fragmentation, we get many micro-myths, lots of them, and lots of tension between them, right? Every small subset of the culture has a different story, according to which it organizes its sense of value, meaning, and purpose, and they conflict. The identity politics of today, which most of you have grown up into, expresses this tension in really concrete ways, rejects that a macro myth can represent the real experienced world of marginalized groups, right? There is no single macro myth that you can sort of get into, like manifest destiny is not a myth that speaks to the many people who were sort of, brutalized during that, what's pictured here, we will see this image again, but the kind of angelic womanly figure leading the pioneers west, right? That doesn't represent the experience of anyone who already had flourishing communities in those landscapes, right? So a challenge for today's world is, if there's a tension in your own experience, in your own relationship with your culture's micro myth and the macro myth, whatever that is, and if you see yourself at odds with the macro myth, with the larger universal, what's being perpetuated as a universal myth, right? The story of America. If you don't see yourself in that, if the American dream isn't something that you see as gaining purchase in your own world, or you having access to, right? And that's just one example. And if you are what you myth, if that's true, if Doty's right about that, then how do you relate to or craft or live into your micro myth, right? That's a real question, right? How do you have a functional myth within a smaller subset of the community that also partakes of a shared moral horizon? It's not easy. I have no easy answers here. A concept from religious studies that might be useful, though, is the concept of spiritual but not religious, or the nuns, people who say, I don't affiliate with one or another institutional religious body, 24% of Americans now claim no religious affiliation, right? But in increasing numbers, that's the largest body of that's the largest single body of a religious group, right? Is the people say I don't affiliate. That is now the biggest group in America. That's new, pretty strange for scholars. But increasingly, those more and more nuns, the people who say I don't affiliate, are sitting in pews, right? They're not standing outside the church, they're going to church. They just don't want to affiliate. Like, I'm not a Catholic, I just go to Mass. I'm not a Baptist, but I go to church, right? They sit in the sacred spaces of institutional religion. They don't spend their time outside of the church as much, right? More of them sit in the pews than outside of it, but still don't affiliate. So they partake, they commune, but they don't connect themselves. And I'm wondering if this is a model we can use here, right? That, institutional affiliation and individual choice can sort of represent for us the macro myth and the micro myth, right? I have individual choice can be something of a corollary to a micro myth, right? But institutional affiliation is something I want to stay distant from. But it's worth considering these folks are still in the pews, and we are all still part of the voting populace. So, I don't know. I have no easy answers. There are no easy answers. But by the end of the course, I hope we all have better answers within ourselves. So 14, intervention of suprahuman entities, right? And these are stories of the gods, yes, most classically, but not only that. They're not always personalized, these entities. Their qualities are depersonalized ideals, like liberty, or like this progress/manifest destiny image. So the question is, for us, as we read myths or stories that are compelling, is what is it that is revealing itself through this myth? And it might be a concept. It might be liberty. It might be progress. It might be science. It might be whatever it is. But that's one aspect of myth is, how ideals, how suprahuman entities, personalized or not, reveal themselves through the stories we tell. And the micro, macro, the bottom slides, we are currently experiencing an America that is very fragmented. And so finding a way through that, or to productively deal with that, is part of what this class will attend to. Finding a way to experience it authentically or productively. So, 15. Aspects of the natural and cultural orders. Now, this is street level. These are the bricks with which myth is built, right? The places, and so I've included some places here. The lack of this in our mythos, the lack of sacred space, the lack of land for the American mythos, right? The colonial mythos that doesn't have a strong connection to the land because it hasn't been here long enough. And the native communities that do have a strong connection to the land have been so marginalized and brutalized that it doesn't make its way into the macro myth, right? So our sacred spaces tend to be nationalistic. National parks might work also, monuments, Vegas, it's the great pilgrimage site of America. More people have visited there. Over half of Americans have visited Vegas. So you have to ask yourself, is our myth a consumer myth? I don't know. We'll set that aside for now. But Doty sees this lack of natural tether as a sign of our own alienation from our bodies, that we've dematerialized ourselves as we dematerialize our mythic culture. He might be right. 16, rituals, ceremonies, and dramas. And he uses this concept of mythos and cultus. And you just think of ceremonies as a way to divorce ritual from categories usually associated with religion. So graduation is a big one. I've included the Blue Angels flyover at the Super Bowl, which is a national ritual where of great respect, right? That is a ritual of ours. So these rituals or ceremonies or dramas, this is part of a myth. This is how myth is built, right? That image on the center bottom of your screen is part of the American mythos. And we should start thinking about that, understanding it as such and thinking about the kind of myth that we are supporting, perpetuating, challenging, trying to change, right? And then finally, secondary elaborations. And he says here, I have in mind the stage of mythic vitality where the believed myths are the least believed, right? Where people start to, at this stage, there's what he calls a recreative mythopoesis, right? Which just means a retelling or a reimagining of things that no longer hold us in a meaningful or compelling way, that often myths take on secondary elaborations so that they can be revived as compelling and meaningful for a culture. And we can think here, we can think about Hamilton, right? This is a story of the Revolution that got reimagined with a very clear perspective focused on marginalized communities, right? People of color are the heroes here, and it's a reimagining, it's a retelling. Those folks, in fact, were mostly white slaveholding men, right? White landowning men, mostly slaveholding. So it is a real upending of that mythic story to change it up, to give us a picture that includes our modern sensibility, or includes marginalized communities within a mythos that doesn't usually accommodate it. It's a great example of number 17. So, our question for this, and we can think about the flyovers, we can think about the monuments, we can think about something like Hamilton. There will be other stories for us. We can think about Kaepernick, right? How do we understand and approach this relationship with our myth, right? Is it given, or is it chosen, right? Is it found, or is it made? And as we'll see through the semester, a lot of it's made. A lot of it's constructed intentionally in ways that most of us don't recognize. It's not part of our nature to see it explicitly or articulate it explicitly. It's the kind of thing that we breathe. It's the air that we breathe. It's the water we swim in, more than anything else. So we'll try to draw as much of that to the surface as possible, and we will move forward to do that.